He never built a machine, never commanded an army, never ruled a nation, and yet his name is spoken in every language. His face is printed on t-shirts and textbooks and postage stamps. His thoughts reshaped the 20th century more than any king or general or president ever could. He redefined our understanding of time itself. He showed that space bends, that light slows, and that mass and energy are two sides of the same thing. And he did it all with nothing more than pencil, paper, and the persistence to keep asking questions no one else thought to ask. He was a man of contradictions, a pacifist whose work helped unlock the atom, a genius who claimed to be slow to learn, a global celebrity who often preferred to be left alone. He was born into obscurity, dismissed by professors, and employed in a patent office when he published a theory that would change physics forever. By the time he was 30, he had overturned centuries of scientific thought. By the time he died, he had become something larger than a scientist, a symbol of curiosity, of rebellion, of deep thought pursued without compromise. This is not the story of a perfect man. It is the story of a thinker, of a migrant, of a violinist, a letter writer, a stubborn theorist with unruly hair and patient hands. A man who spoke softly and walked slowly, even as the world raced to keep up with his ideas. A man who never stopped wondering. This is the story of the most famous scientist in human history. This is the life of Albert Einstein. In a modest apartment in Ulm, Germany, a Jewish couple waits anxiously as their first child enters the world. The year is 1879, and neither the mother nor father can possibly fathom what their newborn son will one day mean to humanity. They couldn't know that the slightly oversized head of their infant, which initially caused them some concern, would one day house one of the most revolutionary minds. The child is quiet at first, unusually so. He doesn't speak until the age of 3, causing his parents to worry. Later in life, he would joke that he had been contemplating the universe, saving his words for when he had something meaningful to say. By the time he does begin to speak, he expresses himself with a peculiar deliberation, as if every word carries weight, as if language itself is a puzzle to be carefully assembled. In school, he isn't the brilliant student many would later assume. His teachers find him stubborn, perhaps even slow. One supposedly tells his father that the boy will never amount to anything. But inside this seemingly ordinary child burns an extraordinary curiosity, a desire to understand the hidden mechanisms of the world, to peer beneath the surface of things, and grasp the fundamental truths that lie beyond ordinary perception. The late 19th century Germany that welcomed Albert Einstein was a nation of contradictions. The country had recently unified under Otto von Bismarck, and rapid industrialization was transforming society. For the Einstein family, middle-class Jewish Germans trying to find their place in this changing landscape, life was comfortable, but not without challenges. Hermann Einstein, Albert's father, was a featherbed salesman who later opened an electrical engineering company with his brother. He was good-natured but not particularly successful in business. Pauline, Albert's mother, was more stern and practical, yet deeply devoted to her children's education. She played the piano beautifully, filling their home with the complex mathematical patterns of Mozart and Beethoven that would later echo in her son's thinking about the universe. The Einstein household valued education, music, and independent thinking. As a boy, Albert was given a compass by his father during an illness. The invisible forces that moved the needle fascinated him. His first encounter with the mysterious powers that govern the natural world. The boy was mesmerized by the invisible forces that moved the needle regardless of how he turned or shook the instrument. That something hidden had to be behind things, he would later recall. Contrary to later myths about Einstein's childhood, he wasn't a poor student. He was, however, a particular kind of learner. Rote memorization bored him, and he rebelled against the militant discipline of German schooling. His real education often took place at home, where his uncle Jacob, an engineer, introduced him to algebra, and where a medical student who dined with the family weekly brought him science books. This moment awakened something profound in him, a lifelong quest to understand the hidden mechanisms of nature. I can still remember, or at least believe I can remember, that this experience made a deep and lasting impression upon me, he would recall decades later. At age 10, Albert's self-education took a more structured turn when Max Talmud, a poor Jewish medical student who took weekly meals with the Einstein family, began bringing him science books. Together, they explored physics, mathematics, and philosophy. Talmud introduced young Albert to Aaron Bernstein's popular books on natural science, a 19-volume series that imagined riding alongside electricity through telegraph wires. These thought experiments, imagining oneself experiencing physical phenomena directly, would become a hallmark of Einstein's approach to physics. Munich's Luitpold Gymnasium, where Albert began his formal education, embodied the rigid Prussian educational system. The school emphasized rote learning and strict discipline. To a boy already inclined toward independent thinking, it felt like a military barracks. One teacher told him, "You'll never amount to anything, Einstein." Though likely apocryphal, this story captures the friction between Einstein's temperament and the educational methods of his day. Religion played a complex role in young Albert's life. Though his parents were secular Jews, they wanted their son to feel connected to his heritage. At age 6, he began studying Judaism, even becoming quite religious for a time. He composed songs in praise of God and kept kosher. Yet by age 12, his encounter with science led to skepticism. Through the reading of popular scientific books, he later wrote, I soon reached the conviction that much in the stories of the Bible could not be true. An incident from his early religious instruction proved formative. His teacher showed the class a nail, explaining it was one of the nails from the true cross. Even as a young boy, Einstein found this dubious. How could anyone know which nail came from that cross? This early questioning of authority would become a defining trait. Despite his religious skepticism, Einstein maintained a profound spiritual sense throughout his life. Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind, he would later write. His spirituality was not tied to religious dogma, but to a deep wonder at the elegant patterns and laws of the universe. When Einstein was 15, his father's business failed, and the family relocated to Italy, leaving Albert behind to finish his education. The separation was difficult for the teenager. After months of loneliness, he developed a doctor's note claiming nervous exhaustion and joined his family in Italy. There, walking among the ancient buildings and Mediterranean landscapes, Einstein experienced a new kind of freedom. These early years shaped not just Einstein's intellectual development, but his character. From his father, he inherited a detached geniality and indifference to practical matters. From his mother came a determined independence and dedication to principle. The tension between German order and Jewish outsider status gave him a lifelong perspective as both participant and observer in society, a valuable stance for someone destined to revolutionize our understanding of the physical world. In Italy, away from the regimented German educational system, Einstein blossomed. He hiked through the countryside, absorbing the beauty of the landscape. During this period, he penned his first scientific paper on the investigation of the state of the ether in a magnetic field. Though amateur in nature, it revealed his growing interest in electromagnetic phenomena and the nature of light. The family's financial struggles taught Einstein frugality and self-reliance. Throughout his life, he maintained simple habits, often wearing the same clothes for days, eating sparingly, and caring little for material possessions. These early experiences fostered in him a lifelong distrust of authority and an instinct to question established beliefs, traits that would serve him well in the coming scientific revolution. At 16, Einstein faced a critical juncture. Having abandoned his German gymnasium education, he needed a path forward. His father wanted him to pursue electrical engineering, a practical career that might provide stability, but Albert had already begun to hear the siren call of pure mathematics and physics. He set his sights on the Swiss Federal Polytechnic School, one of Europe's finest technical universities. There was just one problem: he was too young and lacked the proper educational credentials. Undeterred, Einstein convinced the school to allow him to take the entrance examination. Despite being 2 years younger than most applicants, the results were mixed. He excelled in mathematics and physics, scoring marks that impressed the examiners, but performed poorly in languages, biology, and other subjects. The school's director suggested a compromise. Einstein would attend the cantonal school in Aarau, Switzerland, for a year to complete his secondary education, then reapply to the Polytechnic. It was during this year in Aarau that Einstein experienced a more progressive educational approach. The school encouraged questions, independent thinking, and hands-on experimentation, a stark contrast to the rigid German system he had fled. In Aarau, Einstein boarded with the family of Jost Winterler, a teacher at the school. The Winterlers provided not just lodging, but a warm family environment that deeply affected the somewhat solitary young man. He fell in love with Marie, one of the Winterler daughters, marking his first serious romantic attachment. Though the relationship didn't last, Einstein remained connected to the family. His friend Michel Bessot would later marry Marie's sister, Anna, and Einstein's sister Maya would eventually marry the Winterler's son Paul. In 1896, Einstein finally entered the Polytechnic to study for a teaching diploma in mathematics and physics. The 4-year program exposed him to cutting-edge science, though Einstein was not always an attentive student. He often skipped classes, preferring to study independently or pursue his own scientific interests. His future wife, Mileva Maric, one of the few women in the program, often shared her detailed notes with him. Mileva was a serious, intelligent Serbian woman with a slight limp from a childhood illness. Born to an affluent family, she had overcome significant barriers as a woman pursuing higher education in physics. Their relationship blossomed through shared intellectual passions. Love notes between them discussed not just their feelings but physics problems and scientific ideas. In Mileva, Einstein found both an intellectual companion and emotional support. However, Einstein's independent study habits and occasional arrogance frustrated his professors. Heinrich Weber, who taught physics, was particularly annoyed when Einstein skipped his lectures. When Einstein did attend, he sometimes challenged Weber's teachings, considering them outdated as they didn't address recent discoveries like Maxwell's electromagnetic theories. Marcel Grossmann, a fellow student and gifted mathematician, became another crucial figure in Einstein's life. Disciplined and organized where Einstein was freewheeling and intuitive, Grossmann carefully took notes in classes that Einstein missed. These notes proved invaluable during final examinations. Years later, it would be Grossmann who provided Einstein with the mathematical tools needed for general relativity. By 1900, Einstein completed his studies, but his unconventional approach had alienated several professors. While his classmates received academic appointments, Einstein found himself without a position. For 2 years, he survived through temporary teaching jobs and tutoring. This period of rejection and uncertainty weighed heavily on him. During these difficult years, his relationship with Mileva deepened, though they faced considerable challenges. Einstein's parents opposed the match, believing Mileva too old, she was 4 years his senior, too intellectual, and not Jewish. Despite this opposition, in 1902, Mileva gave birth to their daughter, Liesel, before they were married. Little is known about this child's fate. Family correspondence suggests she was either given up for adoption or died of scarlet fever in infancy. In 1902, through the recommendation of Marcel Grossmann's father, Einstein secured a position at the Swiss Patent Office in Bern as a technical expert third class. The job required him to evaluate patent applications for electromagnetic devices. Though it wasn't the academic position he had hoped for, the patent work proved fortuitous. It trained him to visualize practical applications of abstract principles and to express complex ideas clearly. More importantly, after reviewing patent applications each day, Einstein had time to pursue his own scientific inquiries. His modest apartment became the site of his most creative thinking. In the evenings, he would discuss physics and philosophy with a small circle of friends who called themselves the Olympia Academy. This group, which included Maurice Solovin and Conrad Habicht, read and debated works by Ernst Mach, Henri Poincaré, and David Hume, thinkers who challenged conventional notions of space, time, and causality. In January 1903, Einstein and Mileva married at the Bern city office, without family present. Their first son, Hans Albert, was born in May 1904. Their life was modest but stable. Mileva managed their household and cared for their son, while Einstein worked at the patent office and pursued his scientific investigations in his spare time. Few would have guessed that this patent clerk, not affiliated with any university, working in isolation from the scientific establishment, was about to change our understanding of the universe. Yet it was precisely this distance from academic orthodoxy that allowed Einstein to think more freely, to question assumptions that others took for granted. The year 1905 would later be called Einstein's Annus Mirabilis, his miracle year. In the span of a few months, working evenings after his day job, he produced 4 revolutionary papers that would transform physics. The first explained the photoelectric effect by proposing that light consists of discrete quantum particles. The second provided experimental proof for the existence of atoms through his analysis of Brownian motion. The third introduced special relativity, reimagining the relationship between space and time. The fourth presented his famous equation, E equals mc squared, revealing the equivalence of mass and energy. Each of these papers alone would have secured his place in scientific history. Together, they represented an unprecedented creative explosion. Yet at the time, these publications barely caused a ripple in the scientific community. Einstein remained at the patent office, his genius still largely unrecognized. In 1907, he began formulating the principles that would eventually lead to his general theory of relativity. While working on a review article about special relativity, Einstein had what he called the happiest thought of my life, the realization that a person in free fall would not feel their own weight. This insight, that gravity and acceleration are equivalent, became known as the principle of equivalence and formed the cornerstone of general relativity. Despite his groundbreaking work, Einstein's personal life was growing more complicated. His relationship with Mileva had begun to strain under the pressures of parenthood and Einstein's absorption in his work. Their second son, Eduard, born in 1910, would later develop schizophrenia, adding to the family's challenges. Slowly, recognition for Einstein's work began to grow. In 1909, he received his first honorary doctorate from the University of Geneva. That same year, he resigned from the patent office to accept his first academic position as an associate professor at the University of Zurich. His days as a patent clerk were behind him, but the habits of mind he developed there, clear thinking, questioning assumptions, visualizing abstract concepts, would continue to shape his approach to physics throughout his life. In the autumn of 1911, Einstein stood before the world's leading physicists at the first Solvay conference in Brussels. Just 6 years earlier, he had been an obscure patent clerk. Now he was discussing quantum theory with luminaries like Marie Curie, Henri Poincaré, and Max Planck. Though still young at 32, his penetrating questions and novel ideas commanded respect in this distinguished gathering. The journey from patent office to this prestigious conference had been swift but not without challenges. After brief teaching positions at the University of Zurich and the German University in Prague, Einstein had returned to Zurich in 1912 to accept a professorship at his alma mater, the Swiss Federal Polytechnic. There, he reconnected with his former classmate, Marcel Grossmann, now a professor of mathematics. This reunion proved fortuitous. Einstein had been struggling with the mathematical formulation of his general theory of relativity. He understood the physical principles, that gravity could be understood as the curvature of space-time, but lacked the mathematical language to express these ideas. Grossmann introduced him to tensor calculus and Riemannian geometry, providing the tools Einstein needed to transform his physical insights into rigorous equations. By 1913, Einstein's reputation had grown sufficiently to attract an extraordinary offer: joint membership in the Prussian Academy of Sciences and a research professorship at the University of Berlin, positions previously held by Max Planck. The offer included no teaching obligations, just the freedom to pursue his research. For a scientist, it was the equivalent of being asked to join the pantheon of gods. The move to Berlin in 1914 marked both a professional triumph and a personal turning point. Mileva and their sons initially came with him, but the marriage had deteriorated beyond repair. Within a few months, Mileva returned to Zurich with the children. Their separation agreement, drafted by Einstein, included a curious stipulation. Should he win the Nobel Prize, as he confidently expected, the prize money would go to Mileva for the support of their children. As Einstein settled into his new life in Berlin, Europe descended into the madness of World War I. While most German intellectuals succumbed to nationalist fervour, Einstein maintained his pacifist stance. "When all this is over," he remarked to a friend, "the only thing that will matter is what the Belgians, the French, and the English think of German science." His internationalist outlook and opposition to the war isolated him from many colleagues, but enhanced his later moral authority. Despite the war's disruptions, these Berlin years proved immensely productive. In November 1915, Einstein completed his general theory of relativity, a comprehensive theory of gravity that superseded Newton's work of 2.5 centuries earlier. Over 4 consecutive weeks, he presented a series of lectures to the Prussian Academy, culminating in the final field equations of general relativity on November 25, 1915. The theory was breathtaking in its scope and elegance. Newton had viewed gravity as a force acting instantaneously across space. Einstein reconceived it as the curvature of space-time itself, massive objects like the sun creating a kind of dimple in the fabric of reality, with planets moving along these curved paths like marbles rolling around a stretched rubber sheet. For the theory to gain acceptance, it needed experimental confirmation. Einstein had calculated that his theory predicted a slight bending of starlight as it passed near the sun, a prediction that differed from Newton's. Such bending could only be observed during a total solar eclipse, when the sun's blinding light is blocked, allowing the observation of stars that appear near the sun's edge. In 1919, British astronomer Arthur Eddington led expeditions to Brazil and the island of Principe off the west coast of Africa to observe a solar eclipse and test Einstein's prediction. When the results confirmed Einstein's calculations rather than Newton's, the news electrified both the scientific community and the general public. The London Times ran the headline, "Revolution in Science, New Theory of the Universe, Newton's Ideas Overthrown." Almost overnight, Einstein became a global celebrity. Here was a German Jewish scientist whose theories had been confirmed by an Englishman just after the Great War, a powerful symbol of how science could transcend national and political boundaries. Fame descended on Einstein with a suddenness that startled him. Reporters camped outside his Berlin apartment. Invitations flooded in from around the world. People who understood nothing of relativity nevertheless knew his name and recognized his image. The kindly professor with unruly hair became an icon of genius itself. In 1921, Einstein embarked on his first visit to the United States, accompanying Zionist leader Chaim Weizmann to raise funds for the planned Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Though not a committed Zionist himself, Einstein's vision was more internationalist than nationalist. He supported the idea of a Jewish homeland and a Jewish university as cultural endeavours. The American tour was a sensation. Einstein lectured to overflowing halls at Princeton, Harvard, and other universities. In New York, thousands lined the streets to glimpse him. When asked to explain relativity to the general public, he quipped, "When you sit with a nice girl for 2 hours, you think it's only a minute, but when you sit on a hot stove for a minute, you think it's 2 hours. That's relativity." In 1922, Einstein received the Nobel Prize in Physics, not for relativity, which remained controversial in some quarters, but for his 1905 work on the photoelectric effect. True to his agreement, he sent the prize money to Mileva. Their divorce had been finalized in 1919, freeing Einstein to marry his cousin Elsa, who had been caring for him in Berlin since his separation from Mileva. By the mid-1920s, Einstein's scientific focus had shifted to the emerging field of quantum mechanics. Ironically, having helped launch the quantum revolution with his 1905 paper on the photoelectric effect, Einstein now found himself uncomfortable with the direction the field was taking under physicists like Niels Bohr, Werner Heisenberg, and Erwin Schrödinger. Quantum mechanics described a subatomic realm governed by probability rather than certainty, where particles existed in indeterminate states until measured. Einstein famously objected, "God does not play dice with the universe," to which Bohr reportedly responded, "Einstein, stop telling God what to do." This period marked Einstein's gradual transition from revolutionary to dissenter. While the younger generation of physicists embraced quantum uncertainty, Einstein continued to believe in an underlying deterministic reality. He spent much of his later career searching for a unified field theory that would reconcile quantum mechanics with general relativity, a quest that remains unfinished to this day. Even as his scientific influence began to wane among theoretical physicists, his moral and political authority grew. In a world increasingly divided by nationalism and ideology, Einstein represented the ideal of the scientist as a citizen of the world, guided by reason and humanitarian values rather than tribal loyalties. When Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, Einstein was visiting the United States. As a prominent Jew and pacifist, he immediately recognized the danger. He announced he would not return to Germany, where his summer home was already being raided by Nazi supporters. "As long as I have any choice," he declared, "I will stay only in a country where political liberty, tolerance, and equality of all citizens before the law are the rule." Einstein renounced his German citizenship and accepted a position at the newly established Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. At 54, he became an immigrant once more, beginning the final chapter of his remarkable journey, from patent clerk to professor to prophet of a new physics to global moral exemplar. Princeton in the 1930s offered Einstein a refuge from the gathering storms in Europe. The Institute for Advanced Study, generously funded by department store magnate Louis Bamberger and his sister Caroline Fuld, provided an ideal environment for contemplative research. Einstein was given complete freedom to pursue his work without teaching obligations or administrative duties. He settled into a modest wooden house at 112 Mercer Street, a short walk from the Institute. His second wife, Elsa, created a protective bubble around him, managing their household and shielding him from unwanted intrusions. Their home was comfortable, but not lavish. Einstein had little interest in luxury. His personal style remained simple: baggy sweaters, no socks, and the famously unruly hair that became his trademark. Life developed a steady rhythm. Each morning, Einstein would walk to the Institute, often lost in thought, occasionally stopping to chat with neighborhood children. Colleagues learned not to disturb him during these walks, recognizing that his mind was engaged in what he called thought experiments. In his office, he worked with a minimum of equipment. Pencil, paper, and his pipe were his primary tools. "I have no special talents," he once claimed with characteristic modesty. "I am only passionately curious." Yet beneath this tranquil surface, Einstein was engaged in multiple profound struggles, scientific, political, and personal, that defined the final 2 decades of his life. Scientifically, Einstein had become increasingly isolated. The physics community had embraced quantum mechanics, with its probabilistic interpretation of subatomic phenomena, while Einstein remained convinced that a more complete deterministic theory awaited discovery. "The Lord God is subtle," he famously remarked, "but malicious he is not." Einstein believed that nature's laws, properly understood, would not rely on probability and uncertainty as fundamental features. This position placed him at odds with younger physicists like Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg. Their debates, particularly between Einstein and Bohr, became legendary in the history of science. 2 brilliant minds with fundamentally different philosophical approaches to physics. Einstein would propose thought experiments designed to expose contradictions in quantum theory. Bohr would patiently find solutions within the quantum framework. In 1935, Einstein, along with Boris Podolsky and Nathan Rosen, published a paper proposing what became known as the EPR paradox. They described a scenario involving entangled quantum particles that seemed to communicate instantaneously across any distance, what Einstein dismissively called spooky action at a distance. The paper was intended to demonstrate the incompleteness of quantum mechanics. However, subsequent experiments have confirmed that such entanglement does occur, vindicating quantum theory rather than Einstein's objections. In a strange twist of scientific fate, Einstein's attempt to discredit quantum mechanics actually led to deeper understanding of one of its most profound and useful features: quantum entanglement, which today underlies technologies like quantum computing and quantum cryptography. While wrestling with these fundamental questions about the nature of reality, Einstein was also confronting the deteriorating political situation in Europe. News from Germany grew increasingly dire as the Nazi regime consolidated power and began systematically persecuting Jews. Einstein used his international prominence to help Jewish scholars escape Europe, writing countless letters of recommendation and affidavits to support visa applications. The rise of fascism forced Einstein to reconsider his long-standing pacifism. In 1939, physicist Leo Szilard, concerned that German scientists might develop an atomic bomb, drafted a letter to President Roosevelt warning of this possibility and urging American research into nuclear fission. Szilard persuaded Einstein to sign the letter, knowing that Roosevelt would pay attention to the world's most famous scientist. This letter helped initiate what would become the Manhattan Project. Years later, when the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Einstein expressed profound regret over his indirect role in their development. "Had I known that the Germans would not succeed in producing an atomic bomb," he remarked, "I would never have lifted a finger." The atomic age brought new responsibilities for scientists, and Einstein emerged as a leading voice for international control of nuclear weapons and world government. In 1946, he became chairman of the Emergency Committee of Atomic Scientists, declaring, "The unleashed power of the atom has changed everything save our modes of thinking, and thus we drift toward unparalleled catastrophe." Throughout the post-war years, Einstein continued to advocate for peace, disarmament, and human rights. When the State of Israel was established in 1948, he was offered the largely ceremonial position of president, which he politely declined. Though supportive of Israel's existence, he worried about its treatment of Arab residents and advocated for Jewish-Arab cooperation. In the United States, the post-war era brought the Red Scare and McCarthyism. Einstein's vocal support for civil liberties and his past associations with peace and civil rights organizations brought him under FBI surveillance. J. Edgar Hoover compiled a 147-page file on Einstein, hoping to prove he was a communist sympathizer or Soviet agent. Einstein responded with characteristic moral courage. "If I were to start all over again, I would not try to become a scientist or scholar or teacher. I would choose to be a plumber or a peddler, in the hope of finding that modest degree of independence still available under present circumstances." Amid these political and scientific battles, Einstein also faced personal challenges. His relationship with his sons remained complicated. Hans Albert, who became a professor of hydraulic engineering at the University of California, Berkeley, maintained contact with his father, but their relationship was cordial rather than close. Eduard, diagnosed with schizophrenia in young adulthood, spent most of his life in a Swiss institution. Einstein never saw him again after leaving Europe. In December 1936, Elsa Einstein died after a brief illness. Her death left Einstein profoundly lonely, though he continued to be cared for by his secretary, Helen Ducasse, and his stepdaughter, Margot, who lived with him in Princeton. Through it all, Einstein continued his scientific work, primarily focused on the unified field theory, his attempt to describe all physical forces, including gravity and electromagnetism, within a single theoretical framework. Day after day he filled notebooks with equations, working largely in isolation. Most physicists considered his quest hopeless, believing that quantum mechanics and general relativity were fundamentally incompatible frameworks. Einstein was undeterred. "I want to know how God created this world," he once said. "I am not interested in this or that phenomenon, in the spectrum of this or that element. I want to know his thoughts. The rest are details." This search for underlying simplicity and unity in nature's laws sustained him, even as success remained elusive. In April 1953, Einstein drafted a speech to be delivered on the 5th anniversary of the founding of Israel. In it, he addressed the challenge of achieving peace between Jews and Arabs in the Middle East, a challenge that remains unresolved to this day. He never delivered the speech. It was still sitting on his desk when 2 days later, he experienced severe abdominal pain. Einstein was taken to Princeton Hospital, where doctors discovered an aneurysm in his abdominal aorta. Surgery was suggested, but Einstein refused. "It is tasteless to prolong life artificially," he told his doctors. "I have done my share. It is time to go. I will do it elegantly." For 5 days, he continued working from his hospital bed, making notes on unified field theory. On April 18, 1955, around 1:15 a.m., Albert Einstein took his final breath. A nurse later reported that just before the end, he uttered a few words in German that she couldn't understand. A final message lost to history. Earlier that evening, when his stepdaughter Margot asked if he wanted anything, Einstein had replied, "I want to go when I want to go. It is tasteless to prolong life artificially. I have done my share. It is time to go. I will do it elegantly." The next morning, the news of Einstein's death spread around the world. At the Institute for Advanced Study, colleagues gathered in stunned silence. Einstein had been such a fixture there, such a living symbol of the human capacity for understanding the cosmos, that his absence seemed impossible to comprehend. In accordance with his wishes, Einstein's body was cremated without ceremony on the same day he died. There was no funeral, no grave to become a shrine. He had asked that his ashes be scattered secretly to prevent the creation of a pilgrimage site. Even in death, he resisted the cult of personality that had grown around him. But there was one exception to this desire for posthumous privacy. Before the cremation, without the family's permission, the pathologist Thomas Harvey removed Einstein's brain, hoping to discover the physical basis for his extraordinary intellect. For decades afterward, pieces of Einstein's brain would be studied by researchers looking for anatomical clues to his genius. An ironic fate for a man who had written, "The true value of a human being is determined primarily by the measure and the sense in which he has attained liberation from the self." In the years following Einstein's death, his scientific legacy continued to evolve in ways he could not have anticipated. The unified field theory he pursued so doggedly in his later years remained elusive, but his earlier works, particularly general relativity, grew more rather than less significant with time. As observational and experimental techniques advanced, Einstein's predictions were confirmed with increasing precision. In 1959, the gravitational redshift of light was verified by the Pound-Rebka experiment. In the 1970s, astronomers found evidence for black holes, extreme manifestations of space-time curvature that Einstein's equations had predicted, but that he himself had doubted could exist in nature. In 1979, the gravitational lensing effect, the bending of light from distant quasars by intervening galaxies, was observed, providing spectacular confirmation of general relativity on a cosmic scale. And in 2015, 60 years after Einstein's death, the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, LIGO, detected gravitational waves from the collision of two black holes, confirming one of the most subtle predictions of his theory. Even those aspects of Einstein's work that he himself had questioned acquired new significance over time. The cosmological constant, a term he had added to his equations to create a static universe, and later removed, calling it his greatest blunder when the expansion of the universe was discovered, returned to prominence in the 1990s when astronomers discovered that the universe's expansion is accelerating. Today, this acceleration is attributed to dark energy, which may be represented mathematically by something very similar to Einstein's cosmological constant. In the deepening twilight of a Princeton evening, an elderly man can often be seen walking slowly along tree-lined streets. His white hair catches the fading light. His eyes remain focused on some distant point, perhaps on this world, perhaps on another. To passers-by, he nods politely, but says little. The equations and imagery swirling in his mind would mystify most who greet him. This solitary figure changed our understanding of the universe, not through complex equipment or vast research teams, but through the power of thought itself. He showed us that space bends, time stretches, and the cosmos is stranger and more beautiful than our everyday perceptions suggest. Long after the man himself has gone, when new theories have built upon or superseded his own, when the universe has revealed still deeper mysteries, his essential insight remains, that beneath the apparent chaos of experience lies an underlying harmony accessible to the human mind. In a notebook found after his death, Einstein had scribbled a final reflection. In the light of knowledge attained, the happy achievement seems almost a matter of course, and any intelligent student can grasp it without too much trouble. But the years of anxious searching in the dark, with their intense longing, their alternations of confidence and exhaustion, only those who have experienced it can understand that. But he would also have seen the theory of relativity and his other scientific insights woven ever more deeply into the fabric of modern life. GPS navigation, which requires relativistic corrections to function properly. Nuclear medicine, which applies EMC2 in diagnostic and therapeutic contexts. Semiconductor electronics, which exploit quantum effects he helped identify. All these technologies and more can trace their origins to Einstein's work. The Hebrew University of Jerusalem, which Einstein helped establish and to which he bequeathed his papers, became a thriving center of research and learning. The State of Israel, whose presidency he declined, developed into a complex nation with both remarkable achievements and profound challenges. Europe, which had expelled him, eventually rebuilt itself around principles of cooperation and tolerance he had advocated, though these principles remain under constant challenge. In Princeton, the Institute for Advanced Study continued to provide a home for theoretical research in the spirit Einstein exemplified. There, and in research centres worldwide, physicists continued the quest for a unified theory that had occupied Einstein's final decades. String theory, loop quantum gravity, and other approaches attempted to reconcile quantum mechanics and general relativity, a reconciliation Einstein had sought but never achieved. When Einstein's stepdaughter Margot died in 1986, his personal papers, which he had kept sealed for decades, were finally opened to scholars. These documents revealed new dimensions of Einstein's life and thought, including details of his family relationships, his political activities, and his scientific struggles. They humanized the icon, showing the man behind the myth. These papers also revealed the depth of Einstein's lifelong quest to understand nature's harmony. Even in his final years, when most physicists had abandoned his approach to unification, Einstein continued to believe that beneath the apparent complexity of physical phenomena lay a profound simplicity. The most incomprehensible thing about the universe, he once remarked, is that it is comprehensible. This faith in the intelligibility of nature remained perhaps his most fundamental contribution. More than any specific theory or equation, Einstein gave us the conviction that the human mind, through persistence and creativity, can grasp the underlying order of the cosmos. "I have no special talents," Einstein once wrote to a friend. "I am only passionately curious." This passionate curiosity, this childlike wonder at the mysteries of existence, drove him throughout his life. It allowed a patent clerk to reimagine space and time, a German Jew to become a global citizen, and a man born in the age of horse-drawn carriages to glimpse the fundamental structure of the universe. His life reminds us that the greatest scientific advances often come not from accumulating details, but from asking simple questions and following them with unwavering determination. The important thing, Einstein taught us, is not to stop questioning. In certain rooms, the kind with high windows and wooden floors that creak beneath careful footsteps, there remains a stillness that feels shaped by thought, not because anything extraordinary is happening there in the moment, but because something once did, something slow, deliberate, and almost invisible, like the passage of light through glass. He was not a man in a hurry. That much is remembered, if not always understood. While others paced, he sat. While others demanded clarity, he allowed confusion to linger. While others revised, he paused, and in that pausing, something began to unfold. Not a solution, not even an idea at first, but a question formed so precisely that it left no room for distraction. It had to be turned, and returned to, and held like a fragile object, with edges not yet smooth. There are those who imagine genius as a kind of eruption, sudden, dazzling, electric. But in truth, it is often more like erosion, like the slow wearing down of an assumption, until something unexpected is revealed beneath. And for him, it rarely came with celebration. The steps were small, the pace uneven. A thought occurred in the bath, another while walking between buildings. Mornings were often unremarkable. Tea, bread, perhaps a newspaper folded beside a notebook. And yet those same mornings would stretch quietly into afternoons, filled with equations rearranged on the back of envelopes, or sketches in the margin of a letter never sent. The work was not separate from the day. It moved through it, weaving into the pauses, the small routines, the walks that circled back through familiar streets, until the landscape became a kind of map for thinking. There was something about walking, the repetition of foot against ground, the rhythm of motion without destination, that helped loosen the grip of distraction. On these walks he wore the same coat, the same trousers, the same slightly worn shoes that made no claim to elegance, but allowed the mind to remain undisturbed by choice. No papers were carried, no notes were consulted. The thinking happened in silence, or at least in a kind of inward movement that bore no resemblance to planning, or calculation, or even ambition. In these long hours, the concept of time itself seemed to shift. not metaphorically, but practically. Time bent to thought, not the other way around. A minute stretched into an hour, a page sat unfinished for days, not because it was ignored, but because the next line refused to be forced. He believed, perhaps more deeply than most, that answers could not be summoned on command. They arrived only when approached with the right balance of patience and attention, not waiting idly, but not chasing either. Inside the notebooks, the handwriting varied, sometimes careful, almost hesitant, and at other times rushed, as if the thoughts were tumbling forward faster than the pencil could keep up. Whole pages were crossed out, some were left half blank, and in the margins, short phrases would appear, sometimes questions, sometimes the beginning of a proof, that would stop mid-equation, as if abandoned, not out of failure, but disinterest. He was not always seeking completion, often he was seeking understanding, and that was a different pursuit entirely. Evenings came slowly in that part of the world. The sun seemed to hesitate before setting, casting long shadows through the window panes, softening the corners of the room. Sometimes music played, faint, from another apartment, a radio broadcast drifting through walls, not entirely soundproof. He didn't seem to mind. Sometimes he hummed, sometimes he didn't notice. The rhythm of thought continued beneath the surface, like the workings of a clock tucked inside a desk drawer, audible only if you leaned in. He preferred simple spaces, a small table, a chair that creaked, shelves with books he no longer opened but could not part with. The titles had faded, the spines were frayed, but he knew where each volume lived and what questions it had once tried to answer. Books were not decorations, they were companions, worn, imperfect, and occasionally forgotten, but never dismissed. The walls were often bare, not because he lacked for things to hang, but because too much visual noise disrupted the balance. A single print, perhaps, or a photograph taped to the wall without frame. Order mattered, but not the kind found in straight lines and polished surfaces. It was a subtle order, the alignment of things, not by appearance, but by usefulness, by association, by familiarity earned through years of slow arrangement. At night, he rarely worked late, though his thoughts did not stop when the lights dimmed. He would walk again, sometimes through town, sometimes just around the block. The stars were visible on clear evenings, and he would stop, not to observe, exactly, but to dwell in the thought that the same physical laws that shaped his equations also governed the pinpoints above him. He did not believe the universe was simple, but he did believe it was knowable. That was the distinction that drove him. Sleep came without routine, some nights easily, other nights after long hours of mental turning, like rearranging furniture in a room too small for comfort. He spoke of dreams only rarely, but when he did, they were filled not with stories, but with motion. Elevators falling through infinite shafts, trains approaching at impossible speeds, clocks ticking out of sync, the architecture of time itself bending as if made of soft wire. And still, in the morning, the desk waited. The paper waited. The same problems remained, unchanged by sleep or memory, or the slow wear of repetition. But the mind, slightly altered by rest, could sometimes see them differently. What had once been a barrier might now appear as a curve. What had once been a contradiction might now seem necessary. And with that shift, the pencil would lift again. In those long years of working, not every idea held. Some faded, some fractured, others were set aside, unfinished but not forgotten. He was not discouraged by this. He knew that progress came, not in leaps, but in tolerating uncertainty, just a little longer than expected, in asking questions that seemed, at first, too basic to matter, in walking familiar paths until something unfamiliar appeared, and always, beneath it all, was the sense that the world, strange, elaborate, imperfect as it seemed, might yet reveal a deeper order, not because it owed us answers, but because it was made of patterns and symmetry and the kind of logic that listens only to those who ask with care. There's something about old photographs of scientists at rest, the sleeves rolled slightly above the wrist, a teacup left untouched on the edge of a desk, the expression caught between amusement and weariness that invites the viewer into a rhythm that isn't fast or loud or even particularly linear. In some of those photographs, he is seated in a worn armchair, beside a small table scattered with letters and folded newspaper clippings, not looking at the camera, but somewhere just past it, as though he's still lingering in a thought that hasn't yet resolved itself. But it has the unmistakable air of someone who has spent too long thinking in shapes the rest of the world cannot quite see. The papers are always there, stacked, folded, arranged in ways that suggest a kind of order that only he could decode. Margins filled with numbers, diagrams left half-finished, sentences started and abandoned without apology. These were not drafts in the formal sense. They were records of a mind returning, over and over, to the same handful of questions, not because they remained unanswered, but because they remained worth asking. He spoke often of simplicity, though not in the way most people use the word. It wasn't about being easy or minimal. It was about elegance, an equation that could express something vast in only a few symbols, a principle that didn't require exceptions, a solution that, once seen, felt inevitable. To him, the best ideas weren't the ones that dazzled. They were the ones that, once stated, felt as though they had always been true, waiting only for someone to describe them. And yet, it took years to find those descriptions. Even the famous ones, the formulas etched into popular memory, the concepts taught to school children decades later, were the result of slow, unhurried consideration. He worked not to impress, but to understand, and the understanding never arrived all at once. It crept forward in fragments, a sentence rewritten, a symbol replaced, a mental picture adjusted slightly until the parts align. There's something patient in that kind of work. Not passive, he was never idle, but unhurried in a way that feels nearly impossible now. He walked each day, not to arrive anywhere, but to think. He played the violin in the evenings, not to perform, but to return his mind to balance. He wore the same clothes, followed the same routines, not out of carelessness, but because the absence of decision left more space for thought. And always, beneath it all, was time. Not just the hours of the day, but time itself. The direction, the relativity, the clocks that don't tick in unison, the twins who age at different rates, the stretch of space under gravity's pull. These were not just ideas to him, they were realities that reshaped the way he moved through the world. A train passing on a platform was not just a train, it was a demonstration, a thought experiment, a way of reimagining simultaneity and motion, and the limits of what we assume to be absolute. He could sit with those thoughts for hours, days. He didn't fear contradiction. In fact, he welcomed it, knowing that tension was often a sign that a deeper principle had yet to be found. What others dismissed as paradox, he treated as invitation, a clue that the world was still offering a better answer, if only he could learn how to ask the question differently. And even as the world around him changed, the wars, the migrations, the rise of new technologies, the shifting borders and upheavals of the 20th century, his rhythm remained remarkably intact. He refused public positions more often than he accepted them, and when offered ceremonial titles or accolades, he accepted them with a kind of detachment that suggested the gesture mattered more than the honor itself. People imagined him as a man of certainties, but he lived among doubts. He was known for a few grand ideas, but those ideas rested on years of not knowing, of being wrong, of trying again. His notebooks are full of roads not taken, entire formulations that were set aside, not because they were false, but because they weren't simple enough. He believed the universe made sense, and so, any answer that felt overly complicated was likely a sign he had missed something. That belief, not in any specific result, but in the possibility of harmony, sustained him. Long after his most influential work had been published, long after others had moved on to newer models and emerging frameworks, He remained focused on finding the thread that would unify it all. Motion, energy, matter, quantum uncertainty, and cosmic curvature. He wanted a language that would bind them, not for fame or history, but because he could not let go of the idea that such a language must exist. Some called it stubbornness, others purity. He didn't seem to care either way. He pursued the thread because that was the work. Even when the thread slipped through his fingers, even when colleagues shook their heads and turned to other problems, even when the answers refused to come, he kept at it, not because he expected to succeed, but because the search itself felt like something sacred. In his study, late in life, the books remained in their usual places. The violin rested nearby. Letters arrived each day, some from physicists, others from school children, strangers, world leaders. He answered what he could. He dismissed what didn't need attention, but he remained a man of thought, still scribbling, still sketching, still rearranging the world in his mind, even as the world itself grew louder, faster, more distracted. The walking continued too, through the streets of Princeton, along the canal, under trees that changed with the seasons. Sometimes people recognized him and waved. Sometimes they didn't. It made little difference. He walked with hands behind his back, eyes low, moving not with purpose, but with rhythm. The rhythm of someone whose thoughts stretched beyond the sidewalk, beyond the neighborhood, beyond the moment. And now, years later, the equations remain. The theories are still taught. The name, of course, Albert Einstein, is known in places far removed from science, invoked as a shorthand for intellect, insight, or eccentricity. But beneath all that, something deeper lingers. Not a fact, not a figure, not even a formula, a way of thinking, a patience with the unknown. For those who study him, or simply drift through the fragments of his work, there's a feeling that emerges slowly, that what mattered most was not the speed of the insight or the clarity of the language, but the persistence with which he returned to questions others had set aside. Somewhere in the corner of a room, filled with books that no longer needed to be read, and papers that no longer needed to be sorted, there sat a desk that had known the pressure of 1,000 hours of thought, not all of it productive, not all of it profound, but each hour a small offering to the larger project of understanding how the world fit together beneath the surface of ordinary experience, behind the appearances that others took for granted, inside the structures that only revealed themselves when one looked for long enough, without expectation. The desk itself was not remarkable, not carved from rare wood, not appointed with elaborate compartments or inlays of brass or ivory, but rather plain and unadorned, a surface chosen for function over form, as if the mind that worked upon it had no need for embellishment, no desire to impress, only the quiet companionship of order and the occasional comforting clutter of notes, left in small stacks, awaiting their turn to be rediscovered and either discarded or absorbed into a new line of inquiry that had yet to fully take shape. The room was seldom visited by anyone outside the household, not because it was hidden or forbidden, but because those who came to the house understood instinctively that what happened in that space was not meant to be observed, that the slow, deliberate process of thinking was not a spectacle but a private rhythm, an inward journey whose value lay in the freedom to meander without needing to explain each step to an audience, even a friendly one. There were mornings when the sun arrived late, dragging its pale light across the frosted window panes, and the world outside the house seemed to blur into indistinct outlines, as if time itself had slowed to allow for deeper reflection. And on those mornings, the man would sit with his pencil, resting lightly against his lower lip, eyes unfocused but not idle, mind tracing paths through conceptual terrain, as familiar to him as the walk to the post office, or the shape of the teacup he held loosely in his other hand. In the Institute's halls, his name carried gravity, a kind of intellectual weather that moved ahead of him, causing silence to fall when he entered and heads to tilt slightly forward in anticipation of whatever words might follow, even though he often said very little. And when he did speak, it was usually with the same amused tone one might use when recalling an old riddle that has more to do with the way people think than with the answer itself. Though his notebooks were filled with symbols and sequences that few could follow in full, he wrote them not to dazzle, but to clarify, not to obscure, but to expose, as if the act of writing was less about possession of knowledge and more about building a bridge between intuition and verification, between the soft glow of insight and the firm outline of proof, between the dream and the waking effort to give it shape. Sometimes he walked along the edge of the campus without apparent destination, his steps irregular and his attention drifting from one half-formed idea to another. And though some assumed he was lost in calculation, he would later recall that he was often thinking about very simple things, like why people trusted clocks so much, or how strange it was that children accepted the rotation of the earth without question, while adults needed diagrams and telescopes and equations to feel satisfied that it was true. The mail piled up in a hallway basket, a mixture of fan letters, scientific papers, pleas for support, invitations to speak, and odd offerings from people who believed, for reasons of their own, that he might understand something about the nature of time that could fix their marriage, or unlock a hidden code in the Bible, or explain a dream they had during the thunderstorm 2 weeks ago. And while he rarely responded directly, he sometimes kept those letters near his desk for a few days, not out of vanity or pity, but because they reminded him that the desire to understand was not limited to physicists or mathematicians, but lived in every human being who had ever looked up at the stars and wondered whether the silence between them held any kind of message. He drank coffee that was too strong and wore shoes until the soles thinned out, and while many interpreted these habits as signs of eccentricity, he considered them small efficiencies that allowed his attention to remain where it was most needed, which was rarely on clothing or cutlery or the precise social etiquette of afternoon receptions, but rather on the internal alignment of concepts that only rarely clicked into place. And when they did, they produced a kind of satisfaction that had nothing to do with praise or applause, and everything to do with a private sense that something complicated had become, even briefly, comprehensible. There were photographs on the mantel that had not been dusted in some time, and though the images inside them had faded slightly, he could still recall the occasions clearly, not because they were significant in a public sense, but because they marked transitions in thought, places where a new idea had formed quietly in the back of his mind, while he smiled for the camera or listened to someone else's conversation drifting across the room, moments when the surface of things seemed to relax just enough to let the deeper patterns emerge, like fish coming up for air in a still pond. In the evenings, when the fire had burned low and most of the house had gone to sleep, he sometimes wrote letters he never sent, letters to colleagues long dead, or to friends who had moved away, or to versions of himself from earlier years, trying to capture in language what had changed, not just in the world, but in the way he moved through it. And these letters, written on thin paper, in a tight, careful script, were usually folded once and slipped into the back of a drawer, where they stayed, unread by anyone else, their purpose fulfilled, simply by being written. He often said that understanding something deeply meant learning to forget all the shortcuts, all the labels and summaries that people use to sound informed, and instead returning to the thing itself, to the texture and contradiction and unresolved edge of it. And this, he believed, was the real work of the mind, not to simplify, but to stay with complexity long enough that it begins to show its internal symmetry, not as an illusion of clarity, but as an invitation to look again and keep looking. When spring came and the trees outside began to bud, he would sometimes stand at the front steps for a few minutes before heading inside, watching the wind move through the branches, watching the shadows of the leaves flicker across the sidewalk, and in those moments, there was nothing he needed to calculate, nothing he needed to prove, only the recognition that this too was part of the same universe he had spent a lifetime trying to understand. and that it could be appreciated without needing to be explained. Some believed the answers would come with better instruments, sharper data, more refined models of matter, but he had long suspected that the real frontier was not out there in the world of machines and measurements, but somewhere quieter, more personal, located in the invisible space between instinct and logic, where a simple question could sit unanswered for decades, slowly reshaping the questions that followed it, becoming not a fact to be remembered, but a lens through which everything else was refracted, until even the passage of time seemed to echo with its silent weight. In the library, surrounded by books he had not written, and theories he did not entirely accept, he sometimes ran a finger along the spines, as if to remind himself that knowledge was not a possession, but a conversation, one that could not be rushed, and often could not be resolved. A kind of unfolding that took place not in dramatic discoveries, but in the slow, careful accumulation of insight that built up like sediment in the corners of the mind, until one day it formed a pattern, and the pattern felt true. He knew that most people pictured discovery as a kind of lightning strike, a sudden flash in the dark, but he saw it more as erosion, the gradual wearing away of all the ways an idea does not work, the sculpting of a shape, not by carving it out of stone, but by letting everything unnecessary fall away over time, revealing what had been there all along beneath the assumptions and distractions and premature conclusions. Conversations with colleagues often felt like a dance, sometimes formal, sometimes spontaneous, and while he rarely raised his voice or insisted on his views, there was a kind of quiet gravity in the way he listened, the way he paused before responding, not because he was uncertain, but because he knew that the first response is rarely the best one, and that what seems important in the moment may, upon further reflection, turn out to be a side street rather than a main road. He often admired simplicity, not the simplicity of reduction or slogans or tidy answers, but the kind that comes at the end of complexity, the kind that has been earned through difficulty, like a proof that begins in confusion and ends with a single elegant line, or a melody that begins in wandering and finds its home only after many detours, not in spite of the complexity, but because of it, shaped by it into something essential. The mornings stretched wide in those years, especially in winter, when the light arrived slowly, and the hours between breakfast and lunch seemed to contain entire lifetimes of thought, not because they were filled with activity, but because they allowed so much room for drifting, for returning to an idea he had considered years ago, and seeing it again from a slightly different angle, noticing how it had shifted in meaning, simply by surviving. Somewhere in the middle of one of those mornings, he once wrote that a person who has never made a mistake has never tried anything new, a sentence that others would later quote as encouragement or cliché, but for him it was not a slogan. It was a quiet admission, a recognition that his most important thoughts had always begun in uncertainty, that he had often followed the wrong thread for months before realizing that it was leading him not to a wall, but to a hidden door he had not known to look for. He kept a small notebook in his coat pocket, filled with half-formed equations, strange phrases, snippets of dreams, not because he expected to solve anything in the middle of a walk, but because the movement of the body sometimes loosened the knots in the mind, and there were connections that only revealed themselves after the 10th or 12th repetition of a path, like a code in the rhythm of footsteps, or a message hidden in the shadows cast by the trees along the roadside. At home, the rooms grew quieter over the years, not just in sound, but in presence, as visitors came less frequently, and the attention of the world shifted elsewhere, toward newer voices and younger minds. Yet he never seemed to resent this change, never complained of being forgotten or misunderstood, only continued, with the same pencil and the same lined paper, to pursue the questions that had followed him since childhood, questions that had changed their shape but not their essence, questions that had become, in some sense, his companions. There was a globe in the corner, not particularly large or detailed, but well worn from use, and sometimes he would spin it absent-mindedly while thinking, watching the blur of continents pass beneath his fingers, not as a map to be studied, but as a reminder of the world beyond theory, a world full of contradictions and accidents and unresolved tensions that no formula could fully explain, yet all of it governed, somehow, by rules that did not care whether they were known. As time moved forward, he spoke less often about physics and more often about responsibility, not because he had lost faith in science, but because he had seen what could happen when knowledge outpaced wisdom, when the power to reshape reality was not matched by the humility to consider its consequences. And in those conversations, he did not lecture or accuse, but asked questions, the same way he had always asked them, slowly, patiently, with the belief that answers could only emerge through honesty. Evenings sometimes brought music, not in concert halls or crowded salons, but in small, private moments, when he picked up the violin not as a performer, but as a participant, allowing the notes to rise and fall without expectation, like thoughts that didn't need to be solved.